Hello, and welcome to the Learn to Code podcast with 1 Month. In this episode, I'll be speaking with Brett Martin. Brett is a super badass. He is the co-founder and managing partner of Charge Ventures, which works with early stage companies trying to get them funding here in Brooklyn, New York. And he has quite a legacy of working on just some amazing products. He co-founded a company called Switch, which is a mobile job discovery application, as well as Sonar, an app that I used to use back in the day. He's written for Harvard Business Review and helped launch a little known website called Vice. Yeah, he helped launch the original Vice website. So he's done quite a few amazing things. And I know Brett these days because we work together at Columbia Business School, where he teaches digital literacy and I teach digital literacy. We teach different chapters, so we teach it not at the same time, basically. In this episode, Brett and I discussed the question, what does it mean to be digitally literate? Each of us will share our own definition, as well as some of the takeaways from our course at Columbia University. We'll also dive deeper into that and look at it a few different angles. If you call yourself a technical co-founder or a non-technical founder, what does that mean and how do you define that? As well as if you're hiring for those positions, what are you looking for specifically? How can you tell if someone's digitally literate? At the end of the episode, we will give some tools and resources that you can use and follow up for staying knowledgeable and educated about technology. So without any further ado, here we go. This is my conversation with Brett Martin. Brett, welcome to the show.
Chris, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
I am super excited to chat with you because you teach digital literacy at Columbia and I teach digital literacy at Columbia, but we teach at different times. So I thought this would be a great conversation where we could get together and have a conversation over the question that we get asked probably, hundreds of times a semester. What is digital literacy and how do I become digitally literate? So let's start with the first part of that. Let's just go back and forth. I'd love to hear if you can kick us off. In your opinion, what is digital literacy?
Yeah, brothers from another mother. Digital literacy, it was pretty undefined. I remember when Columbia first asked me to come and teach the class, I myself had to look up digital literacy in Wikipedia. And I can't remember their definition. I think it was something along the lines of the set of competencies required for full participation in a knowledge society. And it sounded like, 6 3-hour classes was going to be a small period of time to teach all of that. So I guess I ultimately define it as the sort of contexts, principles, and tools that anyone needs to make competent decisions in our world, which is increasingly sort of driven and controlled and designed by digital technologies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I remember that meeting. I think we were both on that meeting, and they said they want a course on digital literacy, and part of it was this thing that we thought was super important. And even to this day, when I say I teach digital literacy, the immediate follow-up question is, I should take that. That sounds like something I should take. And then what is digital literacy? Like they know they should take it, but they don't, like nobody actually knows why they should take it. So break that down for me. You came away with this takeaway of, you said it was the tools or can you say that for me again?
The tools, principles, and the context that you need to make decisions in a digital world. So, when they first reached out to me, I think it was originally kind of structured as a coding class, and everyone says, is this a class that you're going to teach you how to code? And obviously, you're not going to teach anyone how to code well in 18 hours. You can help them build a website, which, I've had you come and do it for our class multiple times, which people really love. You're obviously not going to master coding. So I guess, the way we kind of structured the class is this idea of a digital stack, right? So, all the way down from hardware at the bottom layer, and then software and code on top of that, and then sort of front end design and digital product design on top of that, and then kind of the art of product management, which is the the art of building software, which involves a lot more than just writing it, as you know. And then on top of that, sort of the digital marketing and distribution and sort of where social media would sit layer of how digital technologies ultimately come in touch with the people that use them. So that's kind of how I think of it as a technology stack.
Cool. I like that analogy for the class because, I mean, if you're new, like newcomers to the digital world and technology may not understand that this idea of a technology stack is one of the primary, concepts of the technology that we use. There's these different layers. And you just kind of went through them, but I'll try to repeat what I heard. There's the infrastructure, which is like the internet, the wires. On top of that, I'm kind of going briefly here, but there's the applications that we have, and then there's this layer of people that use it, and then all the other, on and on and on. So there is this kind of layer. If you talk to developers and if you talk to people in tech, this kind of idea of layers. And I like the way that you structure the course. I think you were the first one to do that, to bring it with each of these layers. Team effort. I don't know. I don't know how it happened, but yeah, something like that. Cool. So, what are some of the tools that people should be learning? You said one of the definitions of digital literacy is knowing the tools. One part is knowing the context. Let's start with the tools. What are some of the tools that you should know?
Yeah. So, the other, before we jump into that, I guess the other sort of way I think about what are the three takeaways that we try to get people to walk away from the course with are, one is, digital literacy as an ability to read the news, right? So, you see headline after headline coming out, now tech is everywhere in the headlines, right? Tech used to be this, vertical, unto itself, and now it's digital is everywhere. It's ubiquitous technology, so it's in every headline, whether it's talking about business or talking about politics, and Cambridge Analytica. So how do you give people a foundation? So this is where I would say the principles, right? How do you give people a foundation and understanding of what are the tectonic forces that are pushing along digital technologies, so that are driving all of these headlines? And so in this sense, people, you might read about self-driving cars in one hand, and then you might read about artificial intelligence in the next article. And if you didn't know that, both of those those trends are actually highly related, right? They're both being driven by, machine learning, which is the, use of data to, programming with data, right? Enabling machines to ingest a bunch of data and then make decisions based on that, right? And self-driving cars are being driven by these, machine learning algorithms that can help cars see. And artificial intelligence is being driven by machine learning algorithms that are helping, computers see or identifying patterns in data. You wouldn't know that those two are connected. So I think that's what I meant by principles. Is kind of like, what are these underlying forces that are pushing everything?
That's super important.
Do you guys think about that? I mean, you think about that as well?
I love that. That's actually something that I think a lot about, and I think I bring it out in different ways. I love the way that you describe it as this like tectonic force that's kind of moving all these industries. One of the new sections that I added this past semester was this section on the history of the internet, because it's something that I've been studying a lot, and specifically around decentralization as this kind of tectonic force, as you're saying, that is influencing. So, if you're reading the news and you're looking at, Bitcoin, you're looking at the new internet, as they're calling it, this decentralized internet, or if you're looking at stories of Napster, really the driving force, this is back in 2000 when Napster kind of like made music free, and brought us Spotify and everything.
That was awesome.
Yeah, Napster was awesome. For like the 2 years that it was around, it really changed everything. Really, that's kind of the tectonic force there that is influencing all these changes. And then I look at new changes that are coming. But, I don't look at AI as much in my course. We only have one. It's a little bit more blockchain and decentralization and like freedom from like, like digital literacy as a way to be free and like giving yourself tools to make your own destiny in your job and your career on the internet. I think that's a little bit more of the feeling. So I like.
Well, if that's like the context, right? I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about, right? What are these trends, and what's driving those trends?
Yeah.
And that helps people give the context that they can use to read the news coherently.
Yes.
Right. And then, we talked about talk about principles, right? So, you're talking about decentralization, right? And so one of the principles that we talk about in our class is this, architecture of client server architecture, right? And so the idea that, you go from having, mainframes, then you have PCs on every desk, and then you go back to cloud computing, right? And then, you have edge computing. So you have this kind of back and forth, this pendulum between a thick client and a thin client, and sort of that core client server architecture, which you could probably explain here better than I can, but it's a principle, it's a design pattern that keeps rearing its head over and over and over again in tech. And so, when people talk about this new trend of, decentralization, right? It's like, well, that's already happened multiple times in the course of, the history of the internet.
That's great. Yeah. The idea of looking for design patterns helps us look for by looking at the past, we can look at the future for trends, and I think that's really one of the goals of, and why I'm excited to teach the course, because I think it's so encompassing of life these days, and so many of the decisions that we make. And I also think that most people don't understand these conversations about the future of the internet because they don't understand the internet today. And so if you kind of don't have the kind of literacy to understand what's going on to begin with, everything just seems new. It's new. But it's like, what's so new about the new internet? It's like these conversations, these patterns have been happening for decades now. And, it's just having the skills to, in context and principles, all the stuff that you're talking about, to observe it and make sense of it.
What was the fact that the internet is actually a set of pipes filled with cats?
Well, that was true for about a decade, and then they got the cats out, and they, Verizon came and AT&T put wires and stuff. Yeah, no, it's hilarious.
What was the weirdest thing that you found?
Yeah, that was a joke. Just anybody listening, that was a joke. Just to be clear, people are on the internet right now looking for the cats. They're there. They made their way onto web pages. What the funniest thing that I found? Is that what the question is?
What was weird that you found out while researching it? I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff on the internet, so.
One of the most exciting thing that I think is just the genesis, how it started as this. There's so much history just about. I mean, it goes all the way back to Sputnik. Like, the Russians launched Sputnik, and all of a sudden Eisenhower in the 50s is like scrambling because, oh my God, America we're not going to be a superpower, And so in retaliation, he launches these two programs to help America more or less be great again, or whatever, like in the 50s, whatever it is going on back then. And one of the programs to defeat the Russians, from our perspective, is NASA. And the other is ARPA. ARPA is then the agency which basically invents the internet in 1969. And so I find this story fascinating, that there was all this money and all this research going into defeat, in the Cold War, basically came from the Cold War. And that all of the smartest people in the world were just trying to figure out a way to get information from point A to point B without, if there was a nuclear attack, basically was the question. If there was a nuclear attack and America was attacked, how do we preserve our information so that it can't centrally be destroyed? If DC is destroyed, how do we make sure there's copies and a redundancy of communication so that the entire power grid of communication basically doesn't go down? This was the problem. Nuclear war. The answer became ARPANET, which became the internet. I just think that whole story and all the people that are working on it are still working on it today, and their stories and the things they created after that because of that kind of question is, I think, kind of the most interesting or peculiar? So that would be kind of my answer to what you're thinking.
One of my favorite parts about, teaching the history of the internet is that, I think people, at least folks who grew up when we grew up, right? You would always, look at the machine. The machine would do something totally counterintuitive, and it just, wouldn't make sense. And you'd be like, man, why did people ever build things like this? Like, who came up with this, this idea when they were, setting up their computer or trying to find a file in an old DOS, system? And you learn that the internet was not this like perfectly designed top-down architecture, right? But rather like this very organic bottoms-up system that grew. I mean, at one point there were multiple. When ARPANET was around, there were multiple different networks, right? There was, I think it was like 25, and these other. There was no commercial activity allowed on ARPANET, so people set up a internet for pure commerce, and you learn like, oh wow, all these weird different systems have to interconnect somehow. And that was the brilliance of the internet, was getting everything to work together so everyone could kind of do their own thing, and without and still be connected, right? Without some sort of top-down approach, which is kind of weird in the sense that today's internet is pretty centralized, right?
That's the debate. It's this kind of centralization versus decentralization debate. I recently asked a few friends. I was curious if they knew what the word decentralization means as far as the internet goes, and I randomly, because I'm writing about it a lot, and I emailed a few people, and 3 people told me they didn't know what it meant, and they thought it had to do with banking or something, which may or may not be true. But the point, with the point being that in the tech world, these words seem almost cliche because they're so overused. So I think there's like a lot of people who are thinking about this a lot, and a lot of people who have no idea that it's going on. But kind of the one example to follow up with your kind of vision of like this image of putting all these internets together is that like the internet solved the problem of having all these national, perhaps internets, like AmericaNet and America Online or ChinaNet or FranceNet, and then if we did that, there wouldn't be so much of the innovation and sharing and open source that we can all, as a globe, as a world, benefit from. But at the same time, that's also, like you said, the internet's so centralized. That's also was actually we're kind of reverting back to. So we, right now there is really like ChinaNet is basically China has its own internet, more or less. It's kind of censored version of it. So yeah, so this debate I think is fascinating, and it's definitely at least a few classes in digital literacy. I think when I teach it, it's important to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at. Clearly there's that bifurcation going on with China and everywhere else in the world. But even if you just look at like the top 20 most downloaded apps of 2018, according to 247wallstreet.com, I'm not really sure how reputable that is, but they have YouTube, owned by Google, Instagram, owned by Facebook, Snapchat, independent, Messenger, owned by Facebook, Facebook app, owned by Facebook, Bitmoji, owned by Snapchat, Netflix, Google Maps, owned by Google, and Gmail, owned by Google, and Spotify, independent, right? So what is that? Of those 10 spots, Amazon's 11, by the way. Of those 10 spots, 8 of them are owned by three companies. You've got only independents on there are Netflix and Spotify, which aren't exactly small companies.
Yeah, exactly. And I wonder if that even includes Tencent, which is the Chinese company that most Americans don't know is, one of the biggest companies in the world it's basically the Facebook of China. They own a variety of different apps. So yeah, there's just like there's just a handful of players that have a lot of control and over the flow of users in these systems, more or less. So it's pretty fascinating. I want to transition a little bit to the question of if someone understands that they should become digitally literate, that this is important to them, how would they become digitally literate? Like we have a sense of what it means, but how do you do that, maybe short from taking this course at Columbia University? What do you think?
Yeah. So, we talked about two of the. So for me, right, the first pillar is that like literacy, literally being able to like understand what you're reading, right? The second pillar for me is, and the second and third pillar actually are related in the sense that they're one big difference about the internet and everything before it's interactive, right? Like it's not just one of these things where you grab a book and then you sit down and you crunch the book and then all of a sudden what's going on the internet. I mean, the internet is adding probably hundreds if not thousands of books every second, worth of material, right? So I think you have to get involved. You have to look under the hood enough to understand. So I think a lot of folks, they have this idea that there's they're either there's technical and there's non-technical, right? There's a binary, right? They say, oh, I'm not technical, and so I think it's a false binary. Anyone who's quote unquote anyway somewhat technical, that they'll be the first people to tell you that, okay, well, they're technical in a certain area. They know certain thing. They know Python, and or maybe they know how to code in Python, or maybe they know how networking works, right? But they certainly don't know the all of the technologies on the internet. But what has made them different is that because they have taken some technology that powers the internet and gone under the hood a bit, they understand how it works, right? That has shown them that no technology is magic, right? All technology is a concatenation of clever tricks, right? That comes to sometimes a potentially magical result, right? So, if I was advising someone to try to understand, get more digitally literate, I would say, okay, figure out what are the technologies that are powering all this digital technology and this digital revolution, and then look under the hood. I mean, one of the things I think you do great is, when you come in and you help teach students, front end coding, right? HTML, CSS, JavaScript, right? Within an hour, you have people build a web page and show them, what actual code looks like. What you type these characters in, you render it in a browser, and wow, this is the magic that happens. So, and I think that once people have looked under the hood enough to realize it's not magic, it's just sort of something that they can understand themselves, then they're capable, or they lose the fear of going deeper, right? So then once that world's opened up to them, then they can go in and learn more. So I think that's probably the main thing is get a little bit under the hood, so you see what's going on there and realize that you can comprehend it, and then that will empower you to continue your search and continue your learning.
Oh man, I love that. I love the distinction that you're making between technical and non-technical people, because it's something that I struggle with. I agree with you. It's not this, it is a false dichotomy. At the same time, meaning that like, everybody's to some degrees technical and untechnical, but it's so much easier to explain when you're having these conversations. So is there a better way to say that? I don't know if there is, if somebody's non-technical, like how do you quickly say that or describe that kind of person?
I think that person just hasn't been curious yet. Mm-hmm. And maybe they're curious, but they're too inhibited or afraid, or they feel like people are gonna think they're dumb for not understanding, what's going on. I mean, I think you see this a lot. Like, here's an example, right? The internet is something that at this point most people are familiar with to some extent. Although it's surprising every year. I start off every semester of digital literacy with a picture of a blinking box, and I ask folks what it is, and most people don't know. They don't know the difference between their modem and their router. But I think if you look at something like blockchain, right? Most people, they don't know how it works, but they're afraid to admit that, and they're afraid to say that because people are banding around all this jargon, and that because they're afraid to say that, they stay mum or they nod their head, and then they never learn, right? So, I think it's a curiosity thing more than anything, and then the ability to speak out and be comfortable with your ignorance.
So if we switch it to applying to jobs or hiring someone and wondering if someone's digitally literate, are there things that you could look for then? What specifically were you looking for? Could you be looking for?
It's interesting. I just saw this talk up at Columbia, and it was a PhD who was studying. He had studied primates and their signaling behavior and kind of beating their chest, and then he went to work at an investment firm where he was, looking at investments and talking to entrepreneurs, and they were, signaling, with saying certain things. And he did this research on, he was researching jargon, and he was basically saying that, people use jargon when they are when they feel a bit intimidated, when they feel like they are of a lower social status than the people that they're trying to communicate to. So, I think that people who, it's like all things, Steve Jobs. It's hard to make something simple. It's hard to express things in a very clear, simple term. So when folks throw about a bunch of buzzwords, like artificial intelligence, and they sprinkle on top of everything, I think that's usually a signal that they don't really understand what's going on very well. And the folks that can explain complex technical things in very simple, layman terms, those are usually the folks that know what they're talking about.
Ooh, I love that. I think you tapped into something that's a real truth in the hiring and job market, which is people, trying to impress that they know more than they really do. And I think it's easier to tell when someone's not digitally literate, so to speak, than if they are. I think there's some dead giveaways, and I think you pointed out one with using jargon. Another that I've seen on job boards when people are hiring is just throwing every single acronym out there. Like, we're looking for a PHP, Java, AAPI develop, and you'll look at it sometimes and be like, that's not a thing. Like, nobody even knows all those languages, and sometimes that's really intimidating. I remember even when I was first getting started out, I just always assumed that people know more than me. You're like, these people they know more than me. They're interviewing me. And the truth is, that's not always the case. And it can be intimidating thinking I have to learn all of these things. But as you were saying before, like, if you're really good at one thing, it's like just knowing one thing or not being so intimidated, just diving into it is probably the first way to at least start and get that kind of, education.
I completely agree. I mean, I think everyone has a bit of an imposter syndrome going on at all times. And, the people that are insecure are trying to bandy around language that, for fear of getting found out. Whereas the people that have been doing it for a long time, they can just, again, it comes down to the same principles over and over again. We're talking about decentralization. I mean, so was Bill Gates when he was talking about putting a laptop on every desk instead of having a mainframe and everyone going down to the mainframe to
totally. I just heard this term T-shaped skills or T-shaped people recently, but I know it's been around for a while. Have you heard that term?
Yeah, deep in something and then a jack of all trades for the rest.
Yeah, more or less. It may have came from IDEO or in the early 90s. And if you picture the way a T is, I think the top of the T is broad. So you're broad in a lot of things, but I don't know, whatever you want to call that part, the deep part of the T, the part that goes down is deep. So the idea being, I can give you an example of somebody that we hired here at 1 month, who was just phenomenal on our team, was this guy, Zach Valenti. Actually, he may work for Columbia doing video now. I don't know. He's all over the place. I've seen him around, but more or less, he came on to do video editing and production, and we hired him for that. But then when he got there, he had just a broad range of skills, from being able to write well, being able to manage a few people, being able to even just like edit some code. Like he was not a developer. He was not necessarily just like a manager or like a salesperson, but like he was just kind of competent in enough of these things where so that like he was so valuable to our team, but he came in as this video person. And when I think about digital literacy, I think, you know, having that broad top of the T for the tech skills and then just at least one place where you can go a little bit deeper or that you're passionate about or, you know, good at or something like that, but not feeling like you have to do everything, because that's also kind of a recipe for disaster. What do you think?
Well, I think it's also one of those things where by going deep and getting mastery on at least one vertical of skills, oftentimes there's so many patterns and analogies that, you know, you get from mastering one skill that can be applied to something completely different, right? It's like why banks love hiring. People love hiring out of college athlete programs, right? Like employers love hiring college athletes, and it's, you know, it's why does playing basketball or, you know, playing basketball or running, like what does that really have to do with like sitting behind a desk and like making, you know, models in an investment bank? And it's because, you know, so many of those other skills that it takes to create mastery, you know, discipline, hard work, you know, like improving, sort of like gradual improvement, you know, all those concepts are transferable across domains. So, you know, showing that having the deep part of the T shows that you have to learn those sort of transferable skills to get deep in any particular subject area matter.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's so important. And it brings me to my next question, which is, why are MBAs learning to code? Why do MBAs need to take digital literacy? You know, MBAs, the business school, is traditionally this place, you know, where you learn finance, you learn about, I don't know, the economy. And, you know, I didn't go to business school. Did you?
I can't say I did either.
Okay, but we're teaching at business school. So, you know, what is happening with MBAs? Why are they coming to these technical courses? What do you think?
Actually, an MBA sort of once explained this to me best. So I was interviewing for TAs in my class, and I was speaking to this one young woman, and I saw that she was taking a bunch of Python courses at Columbia at the business school. And I said, you know, hey, you want to go into, she wanted to go into marketing or, you know, something like that. And I was like, well, you know, why are you taking all these Python classes? And she said, you know, I think that, here's where I date myself. She goes, I think that Python will be to my generation what Excel was to yours.
She said that to you?
And I was like,
nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty fair viewpoint, right? Like in the same way that, you know, programming languages have gotten, you know, which are fundamentally tools, right? Programming languages are just tools to manipulate data. You know, they've gotten more and more powerful over time, right? So back in the day, you used to have to write lines and lines of code just to get a machine to do anything. But, you know, since then, programming languages have become, you know, more and more powerful, more and more is baked in, more and more functionality comes out of the box. And I think, you know, that's in the same way, you know, productivity tools, right? Like once upon a time, people had just big literal spreadsheet was literally a piece of paper that people wrote numbers on and used to organize numbers, right? It wasn't always, and then someone turned it into an Excel spreadsheet, right? And now, you know, we're turning Excel spreadsheets. If you look at a product like Clay or, you know, Airtable, we're turning spreadsheets into databases, right? And so, you know, bankers, like when I was working on Wall Street, you know, we would use Excel to crunch the numbers, but, you know, now companies are looking for people with even more skills and, you know, more deftness with being able to manipulate data. And so, you know, Python is kind of par for the course these days, I think.
Yeah, I think well said. Yeah, as well as SQL for querying databases as well.
Exactly. So I think it's just, you know, tools have gotten more powerful, and in the same way that, I watch teenagers create social media, with some, I mean, a mixture of dread and envy. I will say, I mean, they're certainly much more handy with their phones. They can use the tool twice as quickly as I can, which is kind of a terrifying thought.
Yeah, that's interesting. That kind of makes me think of one of the new definitions that I've been working with for digital literacy, as being able to solve problems and have the best tool for the job. Really, I don't know. It's just something. What do you think about that as a definition?
As like being able to solve digital problems or with digital tools. Yeah, I mean, I think like it's funny in with your T-shaped model again. It can be digital now because digital is ubiquitous, right? It's baked into every other technology, right? And we talked about this before. This Mark Andreessen, founder of Netscape, one of the original browsers, he has this phrase called software is eating the world, right? And by that he means that sort of traditionally analog industries, like trucking or shipping or healthcare, which hitherto had always been purely offline, purely clipboards and notebooks and paper, right, are becoming digitized, and people are using digital technology to solve problems in those domains that were before never affected by digital technology. So in that sense, your ability to use digital technology to solve a novel problem or maybe an old problem that no one had figured out, like that's certainly a measure of fluency. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and I love the reference to the article. It's an article that Andreessen wrote I believe it's in the Wall Street Journal. Software is eating the world. That's like a definite read, I think, if you want to. I don't want to say like you're going to become digitally literate by reading it, but I would say that this is like one of the canonical like places to start. In 2010, when he wrote it, just talking about the influence that software is having and everything's becoming software. It's really great, and I know we both talk about it in our course. Coming back to this idea of having tools to solve the job and software eating the world, I think that's exactly what's happening, because I think your example with Airtable is really wonderful, or Excel becoming Python. And also, just side note, Airtable, if you haven't checked out Airtable, I'd say just go check it out. I mean, it's a small company that's starting, well, I don't know how small they are, but it's a new company that's basically making like Excel sheets that are more like databases. Like the lines becoming blurry, and to operate, I guess my other point is like, you don't always want to throw code at a problem. And I see that too often. I'd say that goes on my list of you don't actually know what you're doing. A lot of startups, a lot of people new to programming will see that you can solve something with code and then really engineer and take months to like build something, or just do it in a really heavy way because you can, or you just learn this skill. I teach a course called Programming for Non-Programmers, but as part of that, teaching non-programmers about programming, get ready for this, but one of the lessons is non-programmers for programmers, because once you become a programmer, you want to change, everything becomes code, but actually you need to know when to choose the right skill for the job. I guess that's kind of what it comes down to. And so it's about having that kind of wide T-shaped broadness of knowing all the tools, but then that kind of principles and experience even of like, oh, even though I can use this really, even though I can use an axe, I need to use a hammer, whatever it is. It's making those decisions will save you a lot of time, a lot of money, and make you more digitally literate, I believe.
Yeah, the experience to know how to use a tool, the wisdom to not have to.
That's it right there. I think that's a big part of being digitally literate. And yeah, you can see that when you work with people. It takes time. It's a skill. It's like going to the gym. It's like a muscle that you build up. I think that's through experience, not being afraid to fail, and all that goes into building the skill.
I know plenty of front end designers that are perfectly capable of coding a website, but will use Squarespace to stand one up.
That's a perfect example. And when I was guest lecturing in your class last week, that question was asked. It was, okay, now we've been coding. We made this website from scratch in like less than an hour. Does this mean I should, from now on, do websites this way? And my answer was exactly that. A lot of cases, like Squarespace makes it really, this isn't an advertisement for them. It could just as easily be WordPress or Wix or whoever. But if you just need like a simple web page put up without a lot of customization, basically with coding, or basically we're talking about solving problems, and that problem has been solved by, for example, Squarespace. And so you don't need to kind of recreate the wheel. But there are times when you do want to do the code from scratch. And yeah, maybe an example of that decision would be if you need certain kinds of customization, if you are, I don't know, I would say maybe if you want to scale the company, but also even in that case, I'd probably want to wait until you actually had users. And but anyway, we could probably think through a lot of kind of when to use the right tool for that. But Squarespace might be fine,
Yeah, not everything. That's one. Talk about looking at good engineers versus not so great engineers. Great engineer or good engineers always, or not so great engineers always over engineer the darn thing.
There you go.
They build twice as much as they need to. When you the best programmers to work with are the ones that tell you not to write that code and give you a much simpler way of solving it. Whether it's that probably doesn't even involve code in the first place.
Yeah, I got it. The not so good engineers use code jargon, and they just code all these words, and it's not actually, it's like if you don't know what you're talking about, you get code jargon. I've totally been on that project.
When you're a hammer, all the world's a nail.
There you go. I love that quote. Exactly. I'm curious what your favorite resource is for keeping up with digital technology, digital literacy, however you want to frame it. What are some of your favorite books or blogs or whatever comes to mind for staying up to date on technology?
Yeah, in my class, I offer a list of sort of reading resources. For me, it's all different newsletters. I love the Axios newsletters. Inside AI newsletter is really good. Benedict Evans at Andreessen Horowitz writes a great newsletter about big tech, big moves in tech.
How do you find that one?
Just Benedict Evans he works at Andreessen Horowitz actually. So
great.
You just search Benedict Evans newsletter Andreessen Horowitz, and I'm sure you'll find it. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of books, again, this stuff, it moves so quickly. It not often, it's not really in book form, but I will say that, the classic Crossing the Chasm is a wonderful book to think about technology cycles. And then if you want to get really nerdy with it, Carlota Perez is a Venezuelan economist, which is not, it sounds like it. She actually has a really interesting perspective of how financial and social systems interact, and she talks about how technology, like long-term technology cycles, and how they're influenced by both culture and finance. That is a great way of understanding, where do we sit in the middle of the information technology revolution, and it gives you like a really great foundation for thinking about change over the long term.
Is that her website, or is that the newsletter?
She wrote a book. I think it's called, let's see, Technology Revolutions in Financial Capital. That's what it's called.
Cool. That's awesome. And my final question is, Brett, do you have a tool that you use that is really handy and saves you a lot of time that you want to share with us?
Sort of a super shortcut. If you don't have the Honey plugin installed on your browser, then you're passing up some easy cash. I'm thinking in terms of practical things. It's great. It's a little plugin that you add, and then every time you're in a checkout, it looks to see if it can find promo codes off the web that it will automatically add and save you money every time you buy something. That's a pretty nice little trick.
That's smart. Yeah, you could probably use that at 1 month and never thought about that. It's cool.
Sorry about that.
No, that's great. Use it. Go for it.
That's my favorite little tech trick at the moment. Let me see if I've got anything else that's super exciting. Nothing that comes immediately to mind except for Dark Sky, which anyone who doesn't have that yet is missing out. It's hyperlocal weather. Been around for years, but it's great. As opposed to some weather channel, which is just say, raining in New York City today. Dark Sky will let you know exactly where the clouds are and, how long it's going to be, and give you notifications in terms of when it might rain on you.
I love it. And that's also part of the 1 month Python course that we have here. There's a whole lecture. You build a project using that API to make basically your own weather app using Python. So definitely familiar with that over here.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's a great app. Cool. Well, this has been super fun. Thanks for coming on the show, Brett.
Hey, Chris, thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure jamming with you, and looking forward to checking out your history of the internet.
All right. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Learn to Code podcast with 1 month. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find all of the links, show notes, and transcripts at onemonth.com. If you go for it there and search for it, you will find it. If you would like to listen to more episodes with me and Matan Griffel on coding for MBAs, with Chris Coyer from CSS Tricks, and a bunch of other interviews, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, on Spotify, on YouTube. It's all over the internet. Just search for it. While you're doing that, I would love it if you could leave a rating. Just say, hey, this was good. If you liked it, that would be really helpful it really just helps share it with other people. If it gets ratings, it gets pushed up so more people can see it. And I'd really appreciate that. And if you would like to become more digitally literate, you can learn with me at onemonth.com. I have a course called Programming for Non-Programmers, which is exactly that, teaching people who don't know how to program, how to speak and talk the talk of hiring developers, becoming a developer, just understanding more about the digital landscape, the history of the internet, which coding languages to choose. All of that is available at onemonth.com. You can check that out there. We also have courses in coding, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, Python, etc. So thank you again for listening to the 1 month podcast, and I will see you next week.